In the late 1970s, the city of Atlanta, Georgia, stood as an emblem of post-civil rights America. It was a place of transformation, a city that had successfully rebranded itself as the city too busy to hate, the undisputed capital of the New South. This wasn't just a slogan, it was a political reality. Atlanta had built a formidable black political power base, led by its African-American mayor, Maynard Jackson, and bolstered by a growing black middle class. It was a shining beacon, proof that progress was real, that integration could lead to prosperity. The city pulsed with ambition and a deeply held sense of pride. But beneath the gleaming veneer of opportunity and success, the old wounds of poverty and systemic racism still festered, largely in the city's marginalized, forgotten neighborhoods. And it was there, in those shadows, that a creeping, monstrous reality began to take hold. The terror did not erupt in a single dramatic event. It began quietly, insidiously, over the sweltering summer of 1979. The first to vanish was Edward Hope Smith, a 14-year-old boy. 4 days later, 13-year-old Alfred James Evans disappeared. Both were young, both were black, and both were gone without a trace. Their bodies were later discovered on July 28th, dumped miles apart in overgrown wooded areas. Smith had been shot, Evans strangled. Initially, police treated these as isolated incidents, disconnected from one another. But the pattern, the terrifying common thread, was already being woven. As the months turned into 1980, the vanishings accelerated. Milton Harvey disappeared on his bicycle. 9-year-old Yusuf Bell went out for a neighbor's snuff. 12-year-old Angel Lanier simply walked away from a friend's house. Each story was heartbreakingly ordinary, yet each outcome was brutally final. They were found weeks, sometimes months later, in rivers, swamps, abandoned buildings, or dense scrubland, all murdered. The city's official response was slow, frustratingly so. This lack of urgency was immediately interpreted by the affected communities, not as incompetence, but as deliberate neglect. For the predominantly poor black families whose children were disappearing, the message was clear. Your children do not matter enough. If a dozen white children had vanished, the FBI would have been on every corner. The governor would have declared a state of emergency. The perceived indifference from the authorities became a secondary layer of trauma, fueling a deep, boiling resentment that threatened to tear Atlanta apart. This crisis was not just a criminal investigation, it was a full-blown political catastrophe. Mayor Jackson and the city's black leadership were trapped. They were responsible for protecting the community, yet they were inheriting a predominantly white, under-equipped police force that was failing to solve the crimes. To admit the truth that a serial killer was targeting black children was to acknowledge the city's profound vulnerability and shatter its image of progress. But to stay silent was to betray their own people. The result was an atmosphere of paralyzing fear. Parents dressed their children in bright, easily identifiable clothing. Curfews were strictly enforced. Children were taught the faces of the missing alongside their multiplication tables. Neighborhood watch groups, like the tireless Committee to Stop Children's Murders, STOP, sprang up, doing the work that law enforcement seemed unable or unwilling to do. They patrolled the streets, raised funds for private investigators, and kept the faces of the victims in the public eye. As the grim tally approached 30 victims, national pressure finally forced a decisive, public effort.
the FBI arrived, bringing with them sophisticated profiling techniques and resources that local police lacked. They established a joint task force and began searching for the common signature, the minute piece of evidence that would tie these seemingly random acts of violence together. They found it not in fingerprints or confessions, but in the unseen world of forensics. The fiber. Tiny, almost invisible strands of rare yellow-green nylon, specific carpet fibers, and dog hairs were found clinging to the bodies of multiple victims. This microscopic evidence would become the pivot point of the entire case, leading investigators on a trail that culminated on a dark, rainy night in May 1981 at a surveillance post on the James Jackson Parkway Bridge over the Chattahoochee River. That night, a splash was heard. A car was stopped, and the man behind the wheel, a 23-year-old black local named Wayne Bertram Williams, was pulled into the center of the largest and most terrifying criminal investigation in American history. The city, and indeed the country, watched in anticipation. When Wayne Williams was ultimately convicted in 1982 for the murders of 2 adults, cases strategically chosen by the prosecution for their stronger fiber evidence, and subsequently linked by police to the majority of the child murders, a sigh of relief swept across Atlanta. The terror had ended. The case was closed. But this, as we will explore, is where the simple narrative ends and the profound questions begin. Williams, a black man, was convicted using circumstantial fiber evidence, yet many viable leads suggesting a racial motive, including those tied to the Ku Klux Klan, were allegedly dismissed or deliberately buried by the prosecution and the FBI. Was Williams truly the sole horrific monster responsible for the entire wave of killings? Or was he a casualty of a political calculation, a convenient scapegoat whose conviction allowed a besieged city to silence the fear, quell racial unrest, and protect the carefully crafted image of the city too busy to hate? We are embarking on an investigation into the dual reality of the Atlanta child murders, the chilling forensic facts that put a man in prison, and the terrifying, decades-long suspicion of a political cover-up that may have sacrificed justice for expediency.
The Atlanta of the late 1970s was a study in profound contradictions. For the outside world, and indeed for its proud residents, it was a symbol of the American South reborn. Following the turbulence of the Civil Rights Movement, Atlanta had succeeded where many northern cities had failed, transitioning leadership to its black majority without succumbing to the white flight and urban decay that ravaged places like Detroit or Newark. This transformation was embodied by figures like Maynard Jackson, who became the first African-American mayor of a major southern city in 1973. Jackson's administration fostered a sense of economic and political hope. Black businesses flourished, black professionals moved in, and institutions like the Atlanta University Center provided a deep well of intellectual power. The city was a monument to the mantra, "We have overcome." It was, as it proudly claimed, the city too busy to hate. But prosperity is rarely evenly distributed. A short drive away from the gleaming new airport and the modern downtown skyscrapers, the reality for a vast segment of the black community was starkly different. The children who would become the victims of the murders lived overwhelmingly in the impoverished pockets of the city, areas like the West End, Dixie Hills, and various public housing projects. These neighborhoods were characterized by high crime rates, struggling schools, and limited resources. This deep socioeconomic chasm created a paradox. Atlanta was run by black leaders, yet it was failing its poorest black residents. The police force, despite having a black mayor, was still predominantly white, often perceived by the marginalized communities with suspicion and distrust, a relic of the segregated past lurking within the progressive present. This lack of trust meant that when a child went missing, the natural instinct of the community was not to run immediately to the police, but to rely on each other. The victims, these missing children, were largely invisible to the powerful figures downtown. They were the children of the working poor, often left to fend for themselves or watch their younger siblings while parents worked multiple jobs just to keep the lights on. They were the boys and girls trying to make a few dollars running errands for neighbors or simply passing time on the streets because their homes were cramped. They had freedom, yes, but it was the dangerous freedom born of necessity, not privilege. This was the unsettling contrast that the murders would brutally expose. The serial killer, whether one person or a group, exploited the exact fault lines that the city's political machine was trying to plaster over. The crimes targeted the vulnerable, the voiceless, the very people whose economic plight contradicted Atlanta's glossy image. The initial response from the police department reflected this systemic neglect. In 1979, homicides in these neighborhoods were depressingly common, often attributed to domestic disputes or gang activity. There was a dangerous, ingrained assumption that violence against the poor was simply an unfortunate part of life, not an urgent priority demanding massive resources. When two young boys, Edward Smith and Alfred Evans, vanished just days apart, the lack of immediate, vigorous investigation was telling. It was only after more children disappeared and the families began to fiercely organize and demand action that the city was forced to look past its carefully constructed public relations shield. The murders were rapidly revealing that Atlanta was not too busy to hate. It was simply too busy celebrating its own success to notice the suffering and peril of its most disadvantaged citizens. The longer the police dragged their feet, the more the community and the nation began to ask the most uncomfortable questions. Was this a single, deranged individual, or was this a resurgence of racial terror? The political imperative to preserve the image of the Black Mecca would soon collide violently with the reality of a serial killer targeting its Black youth, creating the perfect environment for misdirection and ultimately the deep suspicion of a cover-up. The stage was set for a political crisis masquerading as a homicide investigation.
The summer of 1979 in Atlanta was scorching, but the heat was quickly eclipsed by a chilling, unnatural coldness that crept into the city's poorest neighborhoods. The fear didn't start with a high-profile suspect or an FBI task force. It started with the empty space where a child used to be. The focus of the nightmare begins with two boys who vanished within 4 days of each other, Edward Hope Smith and Alfred James Evans. Edward Smith, just 14 years old, was the first. He was last seen in July 1979. Like many children in his community, Edward was navigating the streets with a degree of independence born out of necessity. He wasn't simply playing hooky, he was living a life marked by the economic hardships of his family. When he didn't return, his family reported him missing, a common enough occurrence in a high-crime area that initially generated little official alarm. Then the terrifying echo. 4 days later, 13-year-old Alfred Evans disappeared from his own neighborhood. Alfred, often called Q by his family, was just a typical boy, known for his energy and his love for simple street games. His disappearance, immediately following Edward's, should have raised every alarm bell in the Atlanta Police Department. But it didn't. There was no immediate, comprehensive citywide alert, no rapid formation of a major investigation team. The cases were filed, but the urgency was missing. The two boys were found on July 28, 1979. Their bodies were discovered in the same remote, heavily wooded area near a landfill. A deliberate, cold-blooded act of disposal that suggested a clear pattern, even if police initially refused to see it. The manner of their deaths was the first signal that something unprecedented and horrifying was happening. Edward Smith had been shot with a .22 caliber weapon, an anomaly that would later confuse investigators attempting to unify all the cases under one method. Alfred Evans, however, had been strangled. Two victims, found together, yet dispatched by different means. This duality immediately complicated the hunt and would later fuel the conspiracy theories that persist to this day. For the residents of the impoverished Black communities, there was an agonizing realization. These weren't random acts of neighborhood violence. This was something systemic, something terrifyingly targeted. And the city's leadership, the very leaders who promised a better future, seemed paralyzed. The lack of an immediate, full-scale police effort cemented the deep-seated suspicion that the lives of poor Black children simply did not carry the same weight as others in Atlanta. The fear deepened with the disappearance of Milton Harvey in September. 14 years old, he vanished while riding his bicycle on an errand. His bike was recovered, but his body wouldn't be found for 2 more months. Then, in October, 9-year-old Yusuf Bell went missing while walking to a local store. Yusuf's case, perhaps more than any other early victim, hammered home the sheer terror engulfing the neighborhoods. He was a small boy, and his body was eventually found in November, hidden in an abandoned elementary school building. He had been strangled. By the end of 1979, the pattern was tragically undeniable. Multiple Black male youths all disappeared from their neighborhoods, all found dead, mostly by asphyxiation. The official narrative of disconnected events could no longer hold up against the sheer, devastating repetition of the facts. The terror had found its first signature, the invisibility of the victims in the eyes of the establishment, making them perfectly visible to their killer. The city was slow to call it a serial killer. The families knew better. They knew a monster was operating with impunity, protected perhaps by the systemic failures of the very institutions meant to protect them. This initial, fatal lag in the investigation not only gave the killer crucial time to refine their methods, but also laid the foundation for the profound lack of trust that would complicate every subsequent development, leading directly to the enduring suspicion of a cover-up. The simple act of a child walking home became a game of lethal chance, and the parents were playing against an opponent they couldn't see, aided by a system that wouldn't listen.
As 1980 dawned, the sporadic disappearances of the previous year began coalescing into a horrifying, unmistakable trend. The narrative of isolated incidents and kids running away collapsed under the weight of mounting bodies. Atlanta was forced to confront the terrifying truth. They were dealing with a serial killer, or perhaps even a coordinated group targeting a specific demographic with chilling precision. The pattern was not subtle. It was a devastating indictment of the city's priorities. The victims were overwhelmingly African American children and teenagers, mostly male, ranging in age from 7 to 16. Crucially, they were all extracted from low-income, predominantly black communities. Their commonality was not wealth or high social standing. It was their vulnerability and their geographical location within the city's marginalized zones. By March 1980, the monster broadened its scope, claiming its first known female victim, 12-year-old Angel Lanier. Angel left her house to visit a friend and never returned. When her body was found 6 days later, strangled and bound with an electrical cord, the city was rocked further. This victim had been dispatched with a ferocity and a slight variation in method, the binding, that served as a terrifying reminder that no child was safe. The methods of disposal were equally chilling. The bodies were often dumped in remote, desolate areas, near wooded lots, construction sites, and vacant lots. Areas that spoke to the killer's intimate knowledge of the city's neglected pockets. The cause of death, while initially varied, strangulation, blunt force trauma, a single gunshot, began to settle predominantly on asphyxiation, often achieved through choking or a sustained chokehold. This consistency hinted at a killer who preferred intimate, hands-on control. This pattern created a palpable, pervasive state of siege in Atlanta's black neighborhoods. Parents became frantic wardens of their own homes. Doors that were once left open were now bolted and chained. The familiar, joyous sounds of children playing freely outside were replaced by a haunting silence. A generation of children learned a new rule of survival. Never walk alone, never talk to strangers, and never, ever be late. The curfew was the only law that truly mattered. The psychological toll on the community was immense. When a child missed dinner, the immediate fear was no longer a scolding. It was that they were already gone, a name soon to be added to the growing list. The pressure on the children themselves was devastating. They had to navigate the daily pressures of poverty and school while simultaneously evading an invisible killer who could be anyone. A neighbor, a friend of the family, or a stranger in a car. The police, meanwhile, were struggling. They were dealing with the phenomenon of serial murder, a concept that was still relatively new and poorly understood in law enforcement circles. The sheer number of victims and the fact that they crossed multiple jurisdictional lines, city, county, and state, resulted in a fragmented, often competing investigation. Crucial resources were wasted, leads were mishandled, and interdepartmental communication broke down. The community saw this struggle and failure not as incompetence, but as a lack of prioritization, deepening the suspicion that their elected black officials were failing to protect them. Or worse, were deliberately underplaying the severity of the crisis to maintain the city's progressive image. By the time the city officially acknowledged that a coordinated serial killer was at work, referring to the perpetrator under the chilling, generalized term, the Atlanta Monster, the number of victims had climbed towards 20 dozen. This terrifying realization finally forced the attention of the state and federal governments, setting the stage for the massive intervention that would eventually bring the FBI to Atlanta
and irrevocably alter the course of the investigation, leading toward a suspect and ultimately the deeply controversial closure of the case. The question was no longer if they would catch the killer, but who they would catch and why.
While law enforcement was bogged down in bureaucratic squabbles and the struggle to identify a pattern, the true immediate response to the crisis emerged from the heart of the grieving communities themselves. This response was raw, desperate, and driven almost entirely by the victims' families, particularly the mothers, who transformed their paralyzing grief into a fierce, unwavering movement demanding justice. The official response, or lack thereof, galvanized these families. They realized quickly that if they waited for the predominantly white power structure to prioritize the deaths of their poor black children, they would wait forever. They took ownership of the search, the awareness campaign, and the relentless pressure on City Hall. These women, many of them working class, some single mothers, became the defiant voice of the city's tragedy. The most prominent face of this grassroots response was the Committee to Stop Children's Murders, STOP. Founded by parents, neighbors, and community activists, STOP became the central hub of community resistance. They didn't rely on police radios or official press briefings. They established their own hotline, plastered the faces of the missing children onto homemade posters, and organized candlelit vigils that drew thousands, ensuring the world could not look away. These mothers marched tirelessly. They stood outside the City Hall, disrupting press conferences and public events, forcing Mayor Maynard Jackson and Police Chief Lee Brown to look them in the eye and acknowledge the failure of the system. Their protests were not always polished. They were often emotional, confrontational, and deeply rooted in the lived experience of systemic neglect. When a high-ranking official suggested that the children were simply runaways, the mothers countered with painful, undeniable evidence of their devotion and character. The narrative of this period is defined by the profound disconnect between the official, often sterilized police reports and the deeply human, devastating cries of the mothers. While police spoke of unsolvable cases and complex jurisdiction issues, the mothers spoke of missing birthdays, empty beds, and the sheer terror of watching their remaining children live in fear. They challenged the idea of the Black Mecca, arguing that the city's celebrated political success meant nothing if the most vulnerable citizens were left unprotected. Their activism was instrumental in raising funds that the city itself refused to allocate generously. They organized charity concerts and appeals, drawing support from national figures and celebrities, most notably the entertainment industry and civil rights leaders. The involvement of figures like Muhammad Ali, Sammy Davis Jr., and eventually President Ronald Reagan's administration was a direct consequence of the relentless, visible pressure exerted by these community groups. They forced the case out of the confines of a local crime blotter and onto the national stage. However, this grassroots effort also exposed painful internal divisions within Atlanta. While the community groups were unified in their grief, the lack of immediate support from the city's African American middle and upper class was sometimes noted. There was an unspoken fear among some affluent Black Atlantans that highlighting the extreme poverty of the victims might further damage the city's reputation, playing into old racist stereotypes. Yet this quiet concern was utterly dwarfed by the moral urgency of the mothers.
By refusing to allow their children to become mere statistics, the families of the victims accomplished what the police department could not. They created a sustained national conversation about the murders. This pressure eventually compelled the FBI to join the investigation, bringing the sophisticated resources and forensic technology that would ultimately lead to a suspect. The groundwork for the eventual arrest and the subsequent controversy over the speed and method of closing the case was laid not by detectives in darkened rooms, but by the relentless, heartbreaking activism of the city's grieving mothers.
The year 1980 was a brutal turning point, with the body count climbing relentlessly, past 15, nearing 20, and with no viable suspect in sight. Atlanta's local law enforcement agencies had effectively reached the limits of their capability. The sheer volume of homicides, coupled with the jurisdictional nightmares crossing city, county, and state lines, overwhelmed the Atlanta Police Department and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The local political crisis had finally escalated into a national security issue, demanding a federal response. It was against this backdrop of widespread failure and public fury that the Federal Bureau of Investigation finally committed its resources. The city government, acutely aware of its failures and the looming threat to its reputation, formally requested assistance, effectively admitting that the crisis was beyond their control. This marked the true beginning of a highly complex and often conflicted multi-agency task force. The FBI brought immediate and sophisticated assets that local police lacked. Most crucially, they introduced the science of criminal profiling. This was an era when the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, based in Quantico, Virginia, was just beginning to codify its understanding of serial criminality. Special agents, including pioneers in the field, were deployed to Atlanta to analyze the crime scenes, the victim selection, and the methods of disposal. Their profile was grim but illuminating. The killer was likely a single, highly organized male, likely African American himself, due to the ease with which he seemed to move within the community, intelligent, capable of charming his victims, and driven by a need for power and control. This profile, while initially helpful in shifting the investigative focus away from the community's primary suspicion of white supremacist groups, would later become a point of intense controversy, criticized for potentially steering investigators too narrowly toward a specific type of suspect. The formation of the task force itself was a microcosm of the conflicts plaguing the case. It included personnel from the APD, the GBI, the FBI, and eventually even the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, which applied epidemiological methods to map the killings. Designed for efficiency, the task force was plagued by internal tensions. Turf wars over jurisdiction, credit, and control of crucial evidence were rampant. The old guard of the local police often resented the intrusion of the federal agents, whom they saw as arrogant and detached. Information sharing was uneven, and critical leads were sometimes overlooked or deliberately kept separate by competing agencies vying to be the one to catch the Atlanta monster. Despite these internal struggles, the FBI's involvement did bring a relentless focus on forensic science. The initial discovery of strange, consistent fibers on several bodies, evidence that the killer was inadvertently transporting, was championed and meticulously pursued by FBI lab experts. It was this focus on trace evidence, the microscopic strands of fabric and hair, that would ultimately lead the investigation away from the volatile realm of racial politics and into the colder, harder world of the laboratory. The FBI intervention provided a much-needed injection of professionalism and resources, but it also introduced a new layer of political complexity. With federal involvement came federal accountability and federal pressure to resolve the crisis quickly. This pressure, combined with the desperate desire of Atlanta's leadership to close the case and restore the city's image, would create the perfect high-stakes environment where expediency might, tragically, be prioritized over thoroughness. The path to a final resolution and the profound doubts about justice had now been firmly paved by Washington.
By the end of 1980, the intense focus on the Atlanta child murders was no longer local news. It was a national obsession. The creation of the multi-agency task force and the arrival of the FBI brought not only forensic scientists, but also media scrutiny that was inescapable. The massive public pressure forced investigators to be transparent, perhaps more so than they would have liked, and certain key pieces of information began to filter out into the public domain. Crucially, the media reported heavily on the type of evidence investigators were prioritizing: trace evidence, specifically fibers and hairs found on the victims' clothing and bodies. This was the killer's fatal mistake, inadvertently leaving behind microscopic clues that tied the victims together. The effect of this public disclosure was immediate and chilling. The killings did not stop, but the methods of disposal changed dramatically. The killer was clearly listening. Up until this point, bodies were often dumped in inaccessible but secluded wooded areas or abandoned buildings, places where forensic evidence, like soil and vegetation, could easily be found. This changed to a far more challenging environment: water. The discovery of bodies in the murky, fast-moving waters of the Chattahoochee River marked a critical shift in the investigation. The river, a sprawling natural barrier that separates Atlanta from its western suburbs, became the killer's new dumping ground. This was a calculated, sophisticated move aimed directly at undermining the forensic investigation. Water acts as a natural cleanser. It washes away potential evidence, fingerprints, blood spatter, trace fibers, and significantly degrades the remains, making a precise determination of the cause of death far more difficult. It also complicates the recovery effort, turning a simple crime scene search into a massive, slow-moving operation involving boats, divers, and difficult terrain. The first victims recovered from the river included Patrick Baltazar, 12, and Curtis Walker, 13. Their discovery confirmed the terrifying new pattern. The killer was now traveling outside the city's immediate urban core to dispose of the victims, strongly suggesting they possessed a vehicle and intimate knowledge of the bridges and access points along the river. The use of the river was a direct, arrogant challenge to the mounting police presence, a taunt that essentially told the investigators, "You know what I'm looking for, so try and find it now." This strategic adaptation narrowed the focus of the investigation further. The killer was operating with an audacious confidence, believing he could outsmart the hundreds of officers and FBI agents now hunting him. This left the task force with only one viable countermeasure: to stake out the river itself. They knew the killer had to use a bridge to deposit the bodies. The vast, sprawling surveillance operation that followed, watching over a dozen bridges across the Chattahoochee, was logistically massive, physically grueling, and emotionally draining for the officers involved.
The shift to the river not only destroyed much of the physical evidence, but also amplified the public's desperation. The city knew the killer was still active and adjusting his tactics, proof that law enforcement was always one step behind. This new, chilling game of cat and mouse along the dark, flowing waters of the Chattahoochee would soon reach its dramatic climax, leading directly to the single most crucial moment in the entire investigation.
The discovery of victims in the Chattahoochee River was a cruel blow. Yet it also provided the investigators with the first concrete geographical constraint on the killer's movements. They knew with absolute certainty that the killer was using the river, and more specifically, the bridges spanning it, as his final disposal points. The vastness of the city shrank to the few crucial miles where the river flowed under key roadways. This led to one of the most exhaustive, round-the-clock surveillance operations in the history of American law enforcement, known informally as Operation Stakeout. The operation required the deployment of hundreds of officers from the APD, the GBI, and the FBI. Their mission was straightforward, but agonizingly difficult. Monitor all 14 major bridges that crossed the Chattahoochee and its tributaries near Atlanta. These stakeouts were conducted in total darkness, silence, and often miserable weather, lasting for weeks on end. Officers were hidden in dense foliage, under bridges, and in unmarked vehicles, equipped with the latest night vision technology of the era. The tension was constant and immense. Every passing car, every flicker of headlights, every subtle noise became a potential cue. The pressure on the officers was both psychological and physical. They were freezing, exhausted, and burdened by the knowledge that the fate of the city's children rested on their ability to spot a single, momentary action in the dark: the slowing of a vehicle, the momentary opening of a door, the decisive act of disposal. The primary goal was simple: catch the killer in the act of dumping a body. The task force was operating under the assumption that the killer had to pull over, open a trunk or door, and physically toss the victim into the water. This act, however quick, would be their opportunity to intervene. The decision to focus so heavily on the bridges reflected the FBI's profiling input. The killer was deemed organized and intelligent. His move to the river was calculated to destroy forensic evidence. Therefore, the counter-strategy had to be equally calculated. The only way to beat his forensic cunning was to catch him red-handed. The stakeouts were not without complications. Officers often had to deal with false alarms, curious locals, and the logistical challenge of coordinating so many agencies in absolute darkness. The operation itself was a massive drain on the city's resources, further increasing the political pressure to achieve a result. Every night the bridges were watched, and every morning the sun rose without an arrest. The public's frustration grew heavier. However, the relentless watch did create a powerful deterrent. For a period, the flow of new victims recovered from the river slowed down, suggesting the killer was aware of the increased police presence and had either paused his activities or was seeking yet another new method of disposal. This brief lull was merely the calm before the storm. The ultimate success of Operation Stakeout would hinge on just one night, on one critical bridge, and one tiny audible sound that would echo through the history of this tragic case. The tension was building to a breaking point, and the night of May 22, 1981, would finally deliver the answer.
The date was May 22, 1981. The time was just before 3 a.m. For weeks, the hundreds of officers involved in Operation Stakeout had endured the numbing monotony of watching dark, cold stretches of highway and water. They were tired, frustrated, and the constant pressure had frayed nerves. Many were beginning to doubt the strategy, wondering if the killer had simply retreated into the woodwork, awaiting the end of the surveillance. But on this particular night, the intense focus on the James Jackson Parkway Bridge, a remote crossing over the Chattahoochee River, was about to pay off in a way no one could have anticipated. At approximately 2:52 a.m., the silence of the pre-dawn hours was broken. An officer on duty near the bridge, stationed in the foliage below, reported hearing a distinct sound, a splash. It was the unmistakable, quick sound of an object striking the water beneath the bridge, a sound that was clearly not natural river noise. Immediately following the splash, a vehicle was observed quickly driving away from the bridge. The adrenaline surged through the ranks of the task force. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. The vehicle was a white 1970 station wagon, and it was quickly intercepted by a team of officers positioned further down the road. The driver was a 23-year-old African-American man named Wayne Bertram Williams. Williams was detained and subjected to an immediate, intense questioning by GBI and APD officers at the roadside. He was articulate, composed, and provided an alibi, albeit a curious one. He was an aspiring photographer and music promoter and claimed he was on his way to an early morning meeting with a young singer named Cheryl Johnson in the neighboring town of Smyrna, hoping to scout a new talent. When pressed on why he was driving over a remote bridge at 3 in the morning, he claimed he was attempting to cross the river to get to his destination and was simply lost. The officers, operating on high alert and massive suspicion, noted several red flags. First, Williams's story was shaky. The location of the stop, the James Jackson Parkway Bridge, was significantly out of the way for a direct trip to Smyrna. Second, the supposed meeting with the singer was implausible at that hour. Third, and perhaps most incriminating, police noted that Williams appeared to be hiding an unnatural, almost forced composure. However, despite the strong circumstantial evidence, the splash, the immediate appearance of his car, and the weak alibi, they had no body. They could not find the object that made the splash, and without evidence of a crime, they could not arrest him. Williams was questioned extensively. His car was briefly searched, and ultimately, he was released. The decision to release him would be heavily criticized later, but it was a cold reality of police procedure. They had insufficient grounds for detention. Yet the officers also knew they had him. They had his name, his face, his car, and his alibi. Over the next 2 days, the Chattahoochee River was scoured relentlessly by divers and boat teams. The focus was directly beneath the bridge and downstream from where Williams's car was stopped. On May 24, 1981, the search yielded a devastating discovery. The nude body of Nathaniel Cater, a 27-year-old man, was pulled from the river just a short distance from the James Jackson Parkway Bridge. The connection was immediate and undeniable. The splash the officers heard was almost certainly the sound of Nathaniel Cater's body being deposited. This discovery transformed Wayne Williams into a person of interest and ultimately the sole suspect in the Atlanta child murders. The long, terrifying hunt was finally focused on one individual.
The discovery of Nathaniel Cater's body and the subsequent identification of the white station wagon immediately thrust Wayne Bertram Williams into the harsh, unrelenting glare of the national media. The public, desperate for a monster to materialize, studied his face. A young, African-American man, 23 years old, who certainly did not fit the initial community suspicion of a white supremacist killer. The media and law enforcement quickly began constructing a profile of Williams, attempting to reconcile the horrifying string of child murders with the man who was now their prime suspect. What they found was a character as contradictory as the city he lived in. Wayne Williams was the only child of two school teachers, Homer and Faye Williams, and was raised in a stable, middle-class home in southwest Atlanta, a stark contrast to the impoverished backgrounds of the majority of the victims. He was academically gifted, a child prodigy who tested out of high school early. However, his ambition often outpaced his success. He was constantly striving for recognition, particularly in the cutthroat world of media. Williams styled himself as a freelance photographer, journalist, and most ambitiously, a music promoter. He was obsessed with the idea of starting his own radio station or launching a musical career, constantly scouting for new talent. This desire for influence and control, often thwarted by his lack of genuine success, was quickly seized upon by profilers as a possible motive. His inability to achieve mainstream success, they theorized, could have fueled a profound frustration and desire for power over the powerless. His interactions with the police during and after the initial bridge stop were critical. Williams was noted for his high intelligence, his verbose and articulate nature, and his aggressive attempts to manipulate the narrative. When questioned, he didn't stumble, he lectured. He argued legal points, questioned police procedure, and maintained an unnerving level of composure under extraordinary pressure. To some investigators, this was the mark of a cunning killer attempting to control the environment. To his supporters, it was the understandable arrogance of an innocent, educated man being unfairly targeted by a flawed system. Williams' activities placed him geographically near many of the victims. As a freelance operator, he was constantly driving around the city, scouting locations and meeting people, giving him plausible reasons to be in the various neighborhoods where children disappeared. The police rapidly established a chronology of his movements and began matching them against the dates and locations of the disappearances. However, the profile was far from complete. There was no history of violence, no established criminal record. The connection was purely circumstantial, tied to his presence at the bridge, and soon to the relentless, silent testimony of the microscopic evidence discovered on the bodies of the victims. The true significance of his identity being African American cannot be overstated. His arrest fundamentally altered the political dynamic of the crisis. It shifted the blame from external, racist terrorism, the community's deepest fear, to internal community pathology. For Atlanta's political elite, Williams was an answer, a way to close the case quickly and decisively, without having to confront the explosive possibility of the Ku Klux Klan or other white perpetrators. But for Williams, it was the start of a decades-long battle against an investigation that he and his supporters argue was designed not to find justice, but simply to find closure.
In the absence of eyewitnesses, fingerprints, or a confession, the case against Wayne Williams relied almost entirely on a silent, relentless witness, the microscopic fiber. This single element would transform the Atlanta child murders into a landmark case in forensic science, simultaneously defining the guilt of the suspect and fueling the enduring controversy of the entire investigation. The FBI's involvement, beginning in 1980, pivoted the investigation from traditional detective work to the meticulous world of the laboratory. Scientists at the FBI Crime Lab in Quantico, Virginia, began the grueling process of analyzing every single trace element collected from the 20-plus victims. What they repeatedly discovered, linking numerous bodies found months and miles apart, were two types of highly unusual synthetic fibers. The first was a peculiar yellow-green nylon fiber. This fiber was not common. Its chemical and physical structure was so distinctive that it could be traced back to a specific manufacturer and, more importantly, a specific use. It was later determined to be a rare variety of carpet fiber, an English olive shade produced by the West Point Pepperell Company, used in a specific type of tufted carpet, primarily sold in the Atlanta area. The second crucial set of fibers were coarse, violet-colored acetate fibers. These were often found alongside the yellow-green nylon and were traced to a specific style of bedding or blanket. When Wayne Williams was apprehended on the bridge and his white station wagon was seized, the investigative focus shifted to his home and vehicle. What the search teams found was astonishing and, to the prosecution, devastating. The yellow-green fibers, matching the rare nylon found on the bodies of multiple victims, including those found in the river, were discovered in abundance on a carpet and a rug inside Williams' family home. Furthermore, the coarse violet acetate fibers, matching those found on other victims, were also present in his house. The connection was not merely that the fibers were similar. The FBI's meticulous analysis claimed they were microscopically indistinguishable. Through chemical composition tests, color analysis, and cross-sectional comparisons, the experts argued that the fibers on the victims almost certainly originated from the Williams residence. But the fiber evidence did not stop at the house. In his station wagon, investigators found dozens of hairs belonging to a German Shepherd dog, hairs that were later identified as coming from Williams' family dog. These specific dog hairs were also found on the bodies of several victims. The prosecution's narrative was simple and terrifying. Wayne Williams, through his travels as a photographer and promoter, would encounter his victims. During the struggle or disposal, he would transfer these distinctive fibers from his carpet, his dog, and his car interior to the victim's clothes. When the victims' bodies were dumped, the fibers, often more resilient than blood or fingerprints, remained as a silent signature, an indisputable link between the killer and his crimes. It was science, not street smarts, that had finally cornered the monster. With the discovery of the matching fibers in Wayne Williams's home and car, the focus of the investigation shifted entirely to the FBI's crime laboratory. The prosecution understood that to secure a conviction, they had to translate minute, microscopic pieces of evidence into clear, compelling proof of guilt for the jury. This required a pioneering application of trace evidence analysis. The case would stand or fall
on the concept of transfer evidence, the principle that every contact leaves a trace. The forensic team, led by experts like Special Agent Harold Dedman, did not merely assert that the fibers looked similar. They spent months establishing that the fibers found on the victims and those found in Williams's environment were, to a scientific certainty, indistinguishable from a common source. The most damning evidence centered on the specific carpet in the Williams residence, a wall-to-wall carpet known as Luxair English Olive. The manufacturer, West Point Pepperell, had detailed records of its production and sale. The FBI meticulously analyzed the chemical composition, the cross-sectional shape, the dye formulation, and even the unique blend of polymers within the yellow-green nylon fibers. They established that the fiber found on the victims matched the Williams carpet fiber in every conceivable way, distinguishing it from millions of other similar fibers. Furthermore, the defense argued that this was a common carpet. Surely thousands of homes in Atlanta had it. The FBI countered this by introducing the concept of coincidence. They argued that it was not just one fiber type, but a confluence of many. 1. The English olive nylon, found on multiple victims. 2. The violet acetate fibers, traced to a bedspread or blanket in Williams's room, found on several other victims. 3. Specific dog hairs, hairs from the Williams family German Shepherd found on multiple victims, a rare coincidence given the individual nature of animal hair. 4. Automotive carpet fibers, fibers traced back to the specific type of automotive carpet used in Williams's white station wagon. The prosecution's narrative was that Williams's personal environment, his home, his car, and his dog, formed a unique, identifiable signature that he carried with him and transferred to every victim he encountered. The forensic experts used microscopic cross-sections and sophisticated chemical tests to demonstrate to the jury the impossibility of these matching fibers being a random coincidence. They presented charts and visual aids showing the identical patterns and chemical fingerprints, turning the highly complex science into a visible story of transfer and guilt. This reliance on fiber analysis marked a watershed moment in the criminal justice system. It elevated the role of forensic science and trace evidence to the level of direct testimony. The state essentially built a wall of circumstantial but scientifically linked evidence. However, it was this very reliance on science that would later fuel the controversy. The process relied on subjective interpretation and probability statistics, which were novel and not fully tested in a criminal court setting at the time. The defense argued that indistinguishable did not mean identical, and that the sheer volume of fibers in a city like Atlanta made coincidence highly possible. Yet, in the charged atmosphere of the courtroom, after years of terror, the overwhelming weight of the cumulative scientific evidence presented with FBI authority became the definitive proof of Williams's culpability.
The cornerstone of the prosecution's scientific argument against Wayne Williams was not just the existence of the matching fibers, but the audacious attempt to quantify the uniqueness of that match using probability statistics. Having established that the fibers from the victims were indistinguishable from those in Williams' home, the prosecution needed to convince the jury that the chances of this being a random coincidence were astronomically small, essentially proving that only Williams could have done it. This chapter of the trial moved beyond simple observation into the complex, often controversial realm of mathematics applied to criminal justice. The prosecution presented expert testimony that sought to calculate the likelihood of an innocent man having this precise combination of unique fibers and dog hairs on his person, in his vehicle, and in his home, while also appearing on the bodies of the victims. The key exhibit focused on the rarest fiber, the Luxair English olive nylon. The FBI had traced the sales of this specific type of carpet in the Atlanta area. Using sales figures and estimates of carpet lifespan, experts calculated the approximate number of homes in the metropolitan area that might have this specific carpet installed. This figure was then compounded by the probability of finding the violet acetate fibers from the unique bedspread, and then further compounded by the probability of finding the distinct hairs of Williams's German Shepherd. The prosecution's argument, presented with meticulous detail by the FBI's forensic team, culminated in a staggering figure. They asserted that the chance of finding this specific, unique combination of fibers and hairs on any random individual in Atlanta was something along the lines of 1 in 100 million, or similar headline-grabbing, minute probability. This was known as the product rule, multiplying the individual probabilities of several independent events occurring together. The effect on the jury was overwhelming. Presented with such an astronomical figure, the circumstantial nature of the evidence seemed to dissolve. The calculation of probability essentially provided the missing link, translating microscopic possibility into absolute certainty. The implication was clear. If the chance of coincidence was 1 in 100 million, the chance of Williams being the killer was near absolute. However, it was precisely this statistical methodology that became the primary target of the defense and the source of enduring academic and legal criticism. The defense argued that the individual probabilities used in the calculation were based on unreliable estimates, not hard data. How could the FBI accurately estimate the number of people who might have driven over the bridge, or how many dogs had similar hair, or how many fibers could have been transferred from a common city source like a police car or a bus seat? They argued that compounding these flawed estimates resulted in a meaningless, misleading final number that unfairly prejudiced the jury. Despite the defense's forceful objections, the statistical evidence was admitted into court. In the context of a city desperate for answers and a jury exhausted by the gravity of the case, the authority of the FBI, combined with the power of an impossibly small number, proved decisive. The prosecution successfully used mathematics to close the gap between circumstantial evidence and absolute conviction, securing Williams's life sentence. But the shadow of doubt, whether this was a triumph of new forensic science or an abuse of probability to rush a conviction,
has haunted the case ever since.
Following the capture of Wayne Williams and the overwhelming presentation of the fiber evidence, the task force had linked the suspect to nearly 24 of the missing and murdered children. The city expected the prosecution to move forward with indictments for the child murders, which had been the source of 2 years of unparalleled terror. Yet the state of Georgia made a stunning and profoundly controversial decision. They would only prosecute Williams for the murders of 2 adult victims, Nathaniel Cater, 27, and Jimmy Ray Payne, 21. This decision was not arbitrary. It was a highly strategic, calculated move born out of the political and legal realities of the time. The chief prosecutor and the legal team were facing an unprecedented case built entirely on circumstantial evidence, the fibers, and they knew they could not afford to lose. The legal rationale was compelling. The fiber evidence linking Williams to Cater and Payne was arguably the strongest and most pristine in the entire body of evidence. Cater's body, discovered in the Chattahoochee River immediately after Williams' bridge stop, provided a near-perfect temporal and geographical link to the suspect. Payne's case also yielded particularly abundant and distinct fiber matches to Williams's car and home. Furthermore, the defense would have exploited the ambiguities and emotional complexities inherent in the child murders. In many of the child cases, the bodies were found after lengthy decomposition, compromising the fiber evidence. Some child victims had different causes of death, like Edward Smith, who was shot. By focusing on the 2 adult male victims, the prosecution believed they could present a cleaner, scientifically robust case, minimizing the emotional melodrama and maximizing the focus on the irrefutable forensic science. However, the political and moral repercussions of this decision were immense. For the mothers of the missing children, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. Their children, the victims who had triggered the massive investigation and national panic, were essentially pushed aside. The decision allowed the defense to argue that Williams was merely on trial for the murders of 2 young men, subtly suggesting that the emotional weight of the child murders was being unfairly leveraged against him. The prosecution's gamble was clear: win the 2 adult cases using the unimpeachable fiber evidence, secure a conviction, and then unofficially attribute the vast majority of the child murders to Williams after the trial. A conviction for any murder, they reasoned, would put the monster away forever and allow the city to finally declare the entire devastating crisis officially closed. This strategy prioritized securing a win, a necessary political act to stabilize the terrified city, over securing justice for every individual victim. This controversial compromise guaranteed closure, but also guaranteed the permanent cloud of doubt and suspicion that has hung over the case for decades. By sidelining the children, the prosecution created the very space for the cover-up theories to thrive, questioning whether the system was truly seeking the truth or just seeking an expedient way out of a national nightmare.
The trial of Wayne Williams in 1982 was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a sensational, high-stakes spectacle that captured the attention of the world. After years of terror and the ultimate relief of an arrest, the city of Atlanta and the grieving community packed the courtroom, desperate for final closure. The pressure cooker environment ensured that every piece of testimony, every cross-examination was delivered under intense scrutiny. The courtroom atmosphere was thick with tension, grief, and simmering anger. On one side stood the prosecution, led by District Attorney Louis Sleeton and Assistant District Attorney Joseph Drolet, presenting a narrative built on cold, hard science.
Their strategy was relentless. Present the overwhelming, interlocking scientific evidence first, then use the two adult victims, Kader and Payne, as the foundation upon which to overlay the patterns of the child murders. The trial was dominated by the technical complexity of the fiber evidence. The jury, comprised of 9 black and 3 white individuals, sat through weeks of highly specialized testimony from FBI experts. Witnesses meticulously detailed the chemical analysis of the Luxair English olive carpet, the cross-sections of the violet acetate fibers, and the unique properties of the German shepherd's hair. The defense, led by attorney Mary Welcome, attempted to challenge the novelty and reliability of this trace evidence, arguing that the science was too new and the statistics too speculative to condemn a man to life in prison. She hammered home the point that indistinguishable does not mean unique. However, the prosecution used a legal maneuver known as the prior similar acts doctrine. They successfully petitioned the court to allow the introduction of evidence from 10 of the unsolved child murder cases. This was a critical turning point. The jury, while officially only tasked with ruling on the murders of Kader and Payne, was constantly exposed to the faces and heartbreaking stories of the missing children. The implication was clear. By convicting Williams of the adult murders, they would also be solving the crisis that terrorized the children. The defense faced an almost insurmountable challenge. They had to fight not only the scientific evidence, but also the immense emotional weight of 2 years of community fear and tragedy. Williams's own demeanor in court further complicated his defense. He was intelligent and often seemed arrogant or confrontational, occasionally challenging the prosecution's witnesses himself, which may have alienated the jury. The most dramatic moments were fueled by the human element. The anguished testimony of the victims' mothers, forced to recount the last moments of their children's lives, hung heavy in the air. This emotional testimony served to underscore the prosecution's secondary message. This trial was about more than just Kader and Payne. It was about finally bringing peace to a tormented city. The trial was a collision of cutting-edge forensic science and raw, emotionally charged human drama. The outcome, heavily influenced by the prosecution's strategic inclusion of the child cases and the perceived coldness of the defendant, was highly anticipated. The stage was set for a verdict that would not just conclude a trial, but officially terminate a 2-year reign of terror.
In a trial dominated by complex fiber analysis and emotional testimony from grieving families, the moment Wayne Williams took the stand in his own defense became the most pivotal, high-risk element of the entire proceeding. It was his chance to confront the circumstantial evidence, articulate his innocence, and connect with the jury. Instead, for many observers and legal analysts, it was the moment he arguably sealed his own fate. Williams was on the stand for an astonishing 8 days, delivering a marathon of testimony and cross-examination. His performance was not that of a scared or remorseful defendant. It was that of an ambitious intellectual fighting for his life, often losing the battle for the jury's sympathy. He did not shy away from the details. Williams meticulously addressed the specific points of the prosecution's case. He explained his presence on the bridge that fateful night as a simple, plausible detour for his early morning meeting. He provided context for the various fibers found in his home,
arguing that as a freelance photographer and budding talent scout, he often came into contact with various people and materials in his car, providing numerous opportunities for innocent fiber transfer. However, his demeanor proved devastating. Williams was highly educated, articulate, and often condescending, treating the courtroom as a debate stage rather than a forum for justice. He frequently challenged the intelligence of the prosecutors, corrected their grammar, and sometimes lectured the court on the nuances of his activities. This arrogance, whether intentional or a defense mechanism against overwhelming pressure, alienated the very people whose votes he needed. To the prosecution, and arguably to the majority of the jurors, Williams' behavior was interpreted not as confidence in his innocence, but as the calculated arrogance of a cunning manipulator. His attempts to be overly precise and logically flawless often made his testimony feel rehearsed and inorganic. Instead of expressing grief or shock over the crimes, he focused rigidly on the technicalities of his alibis and the flaws in the police procedure. The prosecution capitalized on this, using cross-examination to highlight the stark contrast between Williams's privileged, intellectual background and the vulnerable, disadvantaged nature of the victims. They painted him as a sophisticated predator who used his ambition, his constant driving and scouting, as a cover for preying on the weak. His failure to show common empathy was perhaps his biggest tactical error. The jury, having heard the heartbreaking stories of the victims' mothers, was likely looking for any sign of humanity or even simple regret. Williams offered none of that. His testimony reinforced the image the prosecution was building, a cold, highly intelligent individual whose primary concern was himself. When he finally stepped down, the legal battle over the fibers was still open to debate, but the battle for the jury's perception was effectively over. Williams's own words and persona had delivered a psychological conviction, convincing many in the room that the man on the stand was capable of the monstrous acts described. The stage was now set for the final verdict, which, given the atmosphere, felt almost predetermined.
The trial of Wayne Williams reached its dramatic climax in February 1982. After nearly 3 weeks of intense testimony, the jury, burdened by the scientific complexity of the fibers and the overwhelming emotional weight of the Atlanta crisis, retired to deliberate. Their decision would not only determine the fate of one man, but would also dictate whether a terrified city could finally put 2 years of horror behind it. The deliberations were lengthy and reportedly tense, reflecting the novelty of the fiber evidence and the inherent difficulty of convicting a defendant based entirely on circumstantial scientific links. Yet, after 11 hours, the jury returned with its verdict: guilty. Wayne Williams was found guilty on 2 counts of murder for the deaths of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. The gasp in the courtroom was audible, swiftly followed by a mixture of somber relief and quiet jubilation from the side of the prosecution and some community members. The monster, they believed, had been caged. Judge Clarence Cooper immediately sentenced Williams to 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment. For the authorities in Atlanta, the significance of the verdict transcended the 2 adult victims named in the indictment. It was the political and social closure the city desperately needed. Following the conviction, law enforcement, led by the FBI and the GBI, acted swiftly and decisively.
they officially announced that they were closing the files on 20 to 22 of the remaining child and adolescent murder cases, publicly attributing the entire string of Atlanta child murders to Wayne Williams. The official narrative was simple. Williams was the sole serial killer, and the entire devastating episode was over. This mass closure was the ultimate goal of the prosecution's strategy from the beginning. By securing a conviction on the strongest two cases, they gained the legal and political authority to sweep the entire crisis under the rug of certainty. The fiber evidence, now validated by a jury verdict, was retroactively applied to dozens of cold cases, even those where the evidence was sparse or the modus operandi differed slightly. The immediate reaction was mixed. For Mayor Maynard Jackson and the city's leadership, the verdict was a triumph, a necessary step to protect Atlanta's image and assure tourists and investors that the city was safe. The fear that had paralyzed the Black community finally lifted. However, for a significant number of the victims' mothers and many veteran investigators, the abrupt closure was deeply unsatisfactory. They argued that the official announcement was a cynical act of political expediency. Many of the child cases had never been fully investigated. They had distinct anomalies. Some victims were stabbed, others shot. Methods Williams was not charged with. Furthermore, in some of the closed cases, the fiber evidence was weak or non-existent, and other viable suspects had largely been ignored.
The ink was barely dry on Wayne Williams's life sentence when the authorities executed the final, most consequential political act of the entire crisis, the mass closure of the Atlanta child murders. Within weeks of the verdict, the Atlanta Police Department and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation announced with resolute finality that they had officially cleared more than 20 cases of missing and murdered children, attributing all of them to the man now serving time for the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. This rapid declaration was strategically crucial for Atlanta. It allowed the city to wipe the slate clean, assuring the nation that the years of paralyzing fear were over and that the city was, once again, the safe, thriving metropolis it claimed to be. The political imperative to end the crisis decisively had successfully hijacked the comprehensive nature of the criminal investigation. However, the method of this closure was profoundly flawed and became the source of decades of skepticism. No one was ever tried for the murders of the children. The cases were cleared by exception, meaning the police believed they knew the perpetrator, but he would not face trial for those specific charges. The victims' families were simply presented with the conclusion, not the proof. This procedure infuriated many independent investigators and victims' advocates. They pointed out that many of the cases attributed to Williams had crucial inconsistencies that were conveniently ignored in the rush to close the files. Differing modus operandi. Several victims had died from blunt force trauma, stabbing, or even gunshot wounds, like Edward Smith, methods that contrasted sharply with the strangulation technique cited in the cases for which Williams was convicted. Weak or non-existent fibers. In some of the cleared child cases, the telltale fiber evidence was either never recovered or was too contaminated or degraded to provide a conclusive link to Williams' environment. Alternative suspects ignored. By declaring Williams the sole culprit,
the task force summarily dismissed crucial leads and suspects that had been active during the investigation, particularly those pointing towards adult male perpetrators linked to child molestation or white supremacist groups. The narrative crafted by the authorities was one of total victory. One killer, all the victims. But the practical reality was that many of the families were left with no true judicial closure, only an administrative filing that allowed the city to move on. They felt their children had been sacrificed twice, first by the killer, and second by a political system prioritizing image over exhaustive justice. This rushed mass closure created a vacuum of certainty, which was quickly filled with profound doubt and the enduring theory of a cover-up. The simple question remained: if the evidence against Williams in these child cases was so overwhelming, why were no further indictments filed? The logical conclusion drawn by many was that the evidence, outside of the Cater and Payne cases, was not strong enough to survive a rigorous defense challenge, and the city simply feared another trial that might end in an acquittal. The tainted victory of 1982 cemented the notion that the full, unvarnished truth of the Atlanta child murders had never fully emerged.
The immediate relief that followed the conviction of Wayne Williams and the mass closure of the cases was quickly challenged by a chorus of internal doubt and external criticism. The most piercing critiques came not from defense attorneys, but from veteran police detectives, seasoned investigative journalists, and even some members of the federal task force who felt that the truth had been sacrificed for the sake of political expediency. For these dissenting voices, the evidence of a political scapegoat was overwhelming. They argued that Williams, an eccentric but non-violent black man from a stable family, was the ideal suspect for the city's leadership. His arrest allowed Mayor Jackson and the black political establishment to close the terrifying chapter without the even more volatile prospect of admitting that a white supremacist group, such as the Ku Klux Klan, might be targeting their children. Detective Bob Campbell, a veteran investigator on the case, was one of the most vocal critics. Campbell publicly stated that he was pressured to ignore leads that pointed away from Williams and toward other suspects. His frustration, shared by several other long-serving officers, centered on the simple fact that the focus on Williams led to the abrupt cessation of all other investigations, effectively granting immunity to any other potential perpetrators. Journalists who covered the crisis also raised serious ethical questions. They noted the incredible speed with which the city closed the remaining 20-plus cases. This swift administrative action contrasted sharply with the 2 years of paralysis and incompetence that preceded it. They questioned why, if the fiber evidence was so conclusive in all 22 cases, only 2 adult victims were ever brought to trial. The logical conclusion, published in various reports, was that the evidence in the child cases was simply too weak to withstand cross-examination, yet the city needed the public credit for solving the entire crisis.
For many within Atlanta's black community and among critical investigators, the immediate suspicion in 1979 was not a single isolated black killer, but a resurgence of racial terrorism. This was the deep-seated fear rooted in the violent history of the South and it manifested in the primary alternative theory that persists to this day, the involvement of the Ku Klux Klan or other white supremacist groups. This theory was not born out of thin air. It was rooted in circumstantial evidence and the simple, devastating pattern of the victims. All the victims were black, and all were taken from the city's poorest neighborhoods. In the context of the American South, where white terrorism against black communities was a historical reality, this narrative held undeniable emotional and logical weight. The theory gained traction due to several unsettling facts. Prior to Williams' arrest, the FBI and local police had received information and investigated leads pointing toward known Klan members operating in the metro Atlanta area. These individuals were known for their virulent racism and in some cases for expressing an explicit desire to destabilize Atlanta's powerful black political structure. What better way to achieve this than by terrorizing the most vulnerable segment of that structure, the children? The motive, in this view, was not simply psychopathic, but political and racial, to instill fear, create chaos, and undermine the credibility of the black leadership who had promised safety and prosperity. If the Klan could terrorize the city into submission, the narrative of the Black Mecca would collapse. Furthermore, some investigators who worked the case expressed frustration that the FBI's criminal profile, which narrowed the suspect to a single black male who could move freely in the community, might have been a deliberate attempt to steer the investigation away from white perpetrators. Critics argue that a determined white man, especially one disguised or driving an inconspicuous vehicle, could just as easily move through a poor neighborhood, particularly at night. The controversy was compounded by the fact that some early child victims, such as Yusuf Bell, were found dead with evidence that did not immediately align with Williams' later pattern. This lack of uniformity fed the suspicion that multiple hands, perhaps those of coordinated racist actors, were involved. Had the city officially acknowledged a white supremacist plot, the consequences would have been explosive. It would have triggered a massive national intervention, possibly military, and would have completely discredited the city's image of racial harmony. Many believe that the political cost of admitting to white terrorist involvement was simply too high for both the city and the federal government, making the conviction of a black man, even one with ambiguous fiber evidence, the most politically expedient outcome. The KKK theory remains less about finding a specific KKK killer and more about the systemic failure to fully and transparently investigate the possibility of racist motives. The community's deepest fear was that the killer had not just been caught, but that the truth about why the children were targeted had been buried to protect the political reputation of the city.
The core of the conspiracy theory surrounding the Atlanta child murders rests on the belief that evidence pointing toward white supremacist involvement was not simply overlooked, but actively suppressed by high-level officials eager to close the volatile case. The most tangible piece of evidence supporting this claim involves internal investigative files and the actions of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, also known as GBI. During the height of the investigation, before Wayne Williams was officially arrested, the GBI had accumulated intelligence regarding several individuals with documented ties to the Ku Klux Klan.
Crucially, certain individuals under surveillance were recorded on audio tape making comments that suggested complicity or direct knowledge of the child murders. One specific incident involved a recorded conversation where a suspected Klansman allegedly admitted that the group was responsible for taking care of some more trash, a clear, horrifying reference to the murder of a young black victim. In another recorded instance, a Klan leader was allegedly heard complaining that the killings had stopped, expressing frustration that they couldn't continue their plan to destabilize the city. This GBI surveillance evidence was dynamite. If credible, it would have fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation, providing direct evidence of a racially motivated organized terror campaign. It would have forced the FBI and the city to shift resources away from a lone wolf profile toward a larger domestic terrorism inquiry. However, when the investigation pivoted definitively toward Wayne Williams, these leads were abruptly shelved. Critics, including former investigators, have argued that the tapes and the evidence related to the KKK suspects were either heavily discounted or deliberately withheld from the prosecution's main trial strategy. The defense team, working with limited resources, struggled to gain access to the full extent of this internal intelligence. The decision to ignore or downplay the KKK connection was, in the view of many, entirely political. Admitting to a white terrorist plot would have confirmed the worst fears of the black community, potentially triggering mass unrest and certainly ruining Atlanta's carefully cultivated image as a post-racial success story. By focusing exclusively on Williams, an internal suspect, the authorities could frame the tragedy as an isolated incident of community pathology rather than a systemic failure to combat racial hate. The controversy surrounding the GBI tapes and other KKK-related intelligence points directly to the compromised nature of the final closure. The question isn't necessarily whether the Klan killed all the children, which remains highly debated, but why the evidence that suggested they killed any of them was so quickly and efficiently discarded immediately after a black suspect was identified. This suppression of alternative, racially charged theories forms the core argument for those who maintain that true justice, untainted by political calculation, was never served in the Atlanta child murders.
The intense scrutiny of the Atlanta child murders reveals a disturbing political reality that transcended mere investigative procedure. For the city's African-American political establishment, led by Mayor Maynard Jackson, the conviction of Wayne Williams, a black man, was arguably a desperate political necessity, allowing them to stabilize the city and preserve the image of the Black Mecca. The political calculus was brutal. The threat of a white, organized serial killer, particularly one tied to the Ku Klux Klan, as explored in the previous chapter, presented a fundamental danger to the city's identity. If a white supremacist plot were confirmed, it would have shattered the narrative of racial progress and demonstrated that the black administration was incapable of protecting its own citizens from historical enemies. This could have triggered massive, potentially violent civil unrest and a complete loss of confidence from national investors and political allies. Conversely, the conviction of an internal suspect, a black man acting alone, framed the tragedy as a domestic, psychopathic aberration. It localized the problem and contained the damage.
The narrative shifted from "Atlanta is under racist siege" to "Atlanta successfully identified and neutralized a mentally disturbed predator from its own community." This allowed the city to regain control of the narrative, stabilize the economy, and, most importantly, assert the effectiveness of its own black-led police and judicial systems. The city's leaders were walking a tightrope. They were under immense pressure from the grieving mothers and the national civil rights community to deliver justice, but they also faced pressure from the business community and the federal government to suppress chaos. When Wayne Williams, with his weak alibi and strong fiber links, appeared at the James Jackson Parkway Bridge, he became, in the eyes of many, the politically perfect solution. Critics argue that this need for a stable, politically expedient answer is why alternative leads, especially those related to white perpetrators or a wider scope of crime, were so quickly dismissed following Williams' arrest. The investigation was no longer about finding the absolute truth. It was about securing a successful conviction that would allow the city to declare the crisis unequivocally over. The prioritization of Williams' conviction became an act of self-preservation for the city's political structure. It was a Faustian bargain, exchanging the exhaustive pursuit of justice for the immediate restoration of order and reputation. This calculation explains the aggressive use of the novel fiber statistics and the controversial mass closure of the remaining child cases. The city needed one man to carry the weight of nearly 30 deaths so that the city itself could survive the political fallout. The lasting legacy of this political calculation is the erosion of trust. Many in the community believe that their children's lives were used as currency in a desperate political transaction, leaving them with a life sentence of doubt and the lingering question: did the men who ran the Black Mecca betray their own people to save their city?
The intense scrutiny of the Atlanta child murders reveals a disturbing political reality that transcended mere investigative procedure. For the city's African-American political establishment, led by Mayor Maynard Jackson, the conviction of Wayne Williams, a black man, was arguably a desperate political necessity, allowing them to stabilize the city and preserve the image of the Black Mecca. The political calculus was brutal. The threat of a white, organized serial killer, particularly one tied to the Ku Klux Klan, as explored in the previous chapter, presented a fundamental danger to the city's identity. If a white supremacist plot were confirmed, it would have shattered the narrative of racial progress and demonstrated that the Black administration was incapable of protecting its own citizens from historical enemies. This could have triggered massive, potentially violent civil unrest and a complete loss of confidence from national investors and political allies. Conversely, the conviction of an internal suspect, a black man acting alone, framed the tragedy as a domestic, psychopathic aberration. It localized the problem and contained the damage. The narrative shifted from "Atlanta is under racist siege" to "Atlanta successfully identified and neutralized a mentally disturbed predator from its own community." This allowed the city to regain control of the narrative, stabilize the economy, and, most importantly, assert the effectiveness of its own Black-led police and judicial systems. The city's leaders were walking a tightrope. They were under immense pressure from the grieving mothers and the national civil rights community to deliver justice, but they also faced pressure from the business community and the federal government to suppress chaos.
When Wayne Williams, with his weak alibi and strong fiber links, appeared at the James Jackson Parkway Bridge, he became, in the eyes of many, the politically perfect solution. Critics argue that this need for a stable, politically expedient answer is why alternative leads, especially those related to white perpetrators or a wider scope of crime, were so quickly dismissed following Williams' arrest. The investigation was no longer about finding the absolute truth. It was about securing a successful conviction that would allow the city to declare the crisis unequivocally over. The prioritization of Williams' conviction became an act of self-preservation for the city's political structure. It was a Faustian bargain, exchanging the exhaustive pursuit of justice for the immediate restoration of order and reputation. This calculation explains the aggressive use of the novel fiber statistics and the controversial mass closure of the remaining child cases. The city needed one man to carry the weight of nearly 30 deaths so that the city itself could survive the political fallout. The lasting legacy of this political calculation is the erosion of trust. Many in the community believed that their children's lives were used as currency in a desperate political transaction, leaving them with a life sentence of doubt and the lingering question: did the men who ran the Black Mecca betray their own people to save their city?
Since his conviction in 1982, Wayne Bertram Williams has never wavered. Serving 2 consecutive life sentences, he has consistently and emphatically maintained his innocence, transforming his defense from a legal argument into a decades-long public relations campaign. From behind prison walls, Williams actively fights the official narrative, positioning himself not as a serial killer, but as the ultimate, tragic political scapegoat of the entire crisis. Williams' claim is coherent and calculated. He argues that he was the most convenient solution for a city paralyzed by fear and a political establishment desperate for a quick resolution. His arrest, he contends, allowed the authorities to immediately halt the volatile investigation into white supremacist involvement and prevent the catastrophic fallout of admitting that the city's black leadership couldn't protect its most vulnerable citizens. His narrative focuses heavily on the circumstantial nature of the evidence used to convict him. He and his defense team have repeatedly highlighted the flaws in the fiber statistics, arguing that the FBI's 1 in 100 million figure was based on unreliable assumptions and compounded probabilities that unfairly prejudiced the jury. They argue that the presence of common carpet fibers in his car simply proves he was a frequent driver in the metro area, a reality of his life as an aspiring promoter, not a confession of murder. Furthermore, Williams, through interviews and legal filings, has meticulously pointed out the many inconsistencies in the cases that were attributed to him but never tried. He argues that the victims killed by gunshots or stabbings, or those with highly degraded fiber evidence, prove that multiple killers were operating in Atlanta, and the city simply pinned their crimes onto his ledger to clear the backlog of terror. Williams' struggle is deeply intertwined with the continuing activism of the victims' families, who also question his singular guilt. He often positions himself as an ally to these grieving mothers, arguing that both he and they were victimized by the same flawed system, obsessed with closure over truth. He has actively encouraged the reopening and retesting of the evidence, believing that modern DNA technology will finally exonerate him and prove that other killers were responsible.
His continued defiance serves a crucial function in the ongoing saga. It keeps the case open in the court of public opinion. If Williams were to ever admit guilt, the entire controversy would cease. By adamantly denying involvement, he forces the public and the media to continuously question the official conclusion. His highly articulate, often combative defense of his innocence stands in contrast to the subdued, compliant persona often expected of a convicted killer. To many, Wayne Williams is a textbook psychopath whose calculated facade of innocence simply continues his pattern of manipulation. To others, particularly those who distrust the justice system, he remains the ultimate victim of a colossal political conspiracy. An ordinary man sacrificed on the altar of Atlanta's ambition. Decades on, his voice from prison is the constant, nagging reminder that the final chapter of the Atlanta child murders remains unwritten.
While the conviction of Wayne Williams brought political and social relief to the city of Atlanta, it delivered a different, more complicated sentence to the families of the victims: the enduring agony of denied closure. For the mothers, fathers, and siblings who lost their children, the official end of the crisis felt like the beginning of their ongoing struggle for peace and clarity. The cruelest dimension of the mass closure was the legal limbo it created. Because Williams was never formally charged or tried for the majority of the child murders, those cases remained technically cleared by exception, but legally unprosecuted. The families never had their day in court. They never heard the evidence presented specifically for their child's case, nor did they receive a legally sanctioned verdict that named the killer of their son or daughter. This lack of judicial finality has left a profound void. For decades, the families have struggled with the official narrative, which requires them to accept a complicated, scientifically contested conclusion without the simple emotional satisfaction of a dedicated trial. They are asked to trust a system that they believe failed them during the investigation and betrayed them during the closure. The mothers, who bravely formed groups like STOP to demand action, have been the primary carriers of this decades-long grief. They have become historians of their children's cases, constantly comparing notes, pointing out inconsistencies, and lobbying authorities to re-examine the evidence. For them, Wayne Williams's guilt is less important than the simple legal recognition of their children's individual tragedies. They feel that their children were treated as mere statistics, their lives collectively grouped together to achieve a political objective, rather than being honored as unique human beings who deserved their own pursuit of justice. The ongoing controversy surrounding Williams only exacerbates their pain. Every time a new documentary airs or a legal challenge is filed, the families are forced to relive the trauma, their wounds reopened by the fresh possibility that the real killer or killers may still be free. They cannot mourn in peace because the foundational truth of their loss remains disputed. Moreover, the financial and emotional toll has been immense. Many families were forced into poverty by the costs associated with the searches and funerals. The trauma of the period remains an unhealed scar on the neighborhoods of Atlanta, with many of the victims' siblings and peers carrying the psychological weight of surviving the siege. The legacy of the Atlanta child murders is ultimately
the story of these families. Their fight is not just for the legal classification of the crime, but for the basic dignity of their lost children. They seek the simple, unambiguous truth, a trial for every case and a transparent presentation of all the evidence to ensure that their children's lives were not taken in vain and that the full depth of the city's failures is finally acknowledged. Their enduring agony is the loudest voice still calling for a truly definitive resolution.
Decades after the verdict, the relentless persistence of the victims' families and the enduring pressure from investigative journalists finally forced a political reckoning. The advent of sophisticated DNA technology, capable of analyzing trace samples that were too minute or degraded in the 1980s, offered a profound opportunity to re-examine the physical evidence and potentially overturn or confirm the original conclusion. The crucial turning point came in 2019, when Atlanta's mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, herself a native of the city who lived through the era of fear, announced that the city would officially order the retesting of key evidence from several of the child murder cases. This decision was a direct response to the community's decades-long demand for clarity and an acknowledgement that the mass closure of 1982, however expedient, was morally unsatisfactory. The focus of this renewed investigation is on the physical evidence still retained from the original cases: clothing, hair samples, and biological residue, all of which were collected before the widespread use of DNA technology. The hope is that modern analysis could achieve one of two outcomes. 1. Exoneration. Finding DNA from an unidentified male on the victim's clothing, thereby confirming Wayne Williams' claim of innocence and validating the long-held belief that another killer or killers were responsible for the children's deaths. 2. Confirmation. Finding irrefutable DNA evidence linking Wayne Williams directly to the victims, thereby silencing the controversy and securing justice for the child cases that were only cleared by exception. This reopening of the files is not just a scientific endeavor. It is a profound symbolic act. It acknowledges the failures of the past and prioritizes the emotional needs of the grieving families. For many of the mothers, this is their last, best chance to find the definitive truth about their children's final moments. However, the process is fraught with immense challenges. 40 years have passed, and the chain of custody for some evidence is questionable. Many samples have been exposed to environmental degradation or contaminated by repeated handling over the decades. The sheer difficulty of extracting viable DNA from such old, compromised material means that a definitive result, either way, is far from guaranteed. The political stakes remain incredibly high. If the retesting reveals multiple profiles, the city will be forced to confront the possibility of multiple unsolved murders and the uncomfortable historical reality
that the 1982 task force deliberately targeted a single suspect to ensure closure. Conversely, if Williams' DNA is found, it will vindicate the original forensic science and finally bring a degree of peace to the victims' families and the city itself. The fight for the truth is now waged in the sterile environment of the forensic lab, where microscopic remnants hold the power to rewrite one of the most painful and controversial chapters in American criminal history. The families continue to wait, clinging to the hope that science will deliver the closure that politics denied them.
Regardless of the final outcome of the current DNA retesting, the trial of Wayne Williams left an indelible and complex mark on the American legal system, fundamentally changing the relationship between science, evidence, and the courtroom. The Atlanta child murders case is not just a tragedy of lost children. It is a pivotal chapter in the history of forensic science and criminal law. The case was the first major U.S. murder trial to successfully rely almost entirely on trace evidence, specifically the microscopic analysis of fibers. Prior to 1982, convictions were typically secured through confessions, eyewitness accounts, or macro-level evidence like fingerprints and ballistics. The prosecution's success in presenting the fiber evidence, demonstrating the transfer of specific, unique materials from the killer's environment to the victims, legitimized forensic science in a way that had never been done before. The trial essentially made household names of forensic experts and revolutionized crime scene investigation. After Atlanta, police forces across the nation began dedicating significant resources to trace evidence collection. Crime scene protocols were drastically altered, with investigators becoming meticulous about contamination control, understanding that a single stray fiber could make or break a case. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit also gained immense prestige, as their initial profile of a single, organized killer was seen as having been proven correct by the subsequent forensic links. However, the case's legacy is also deeply controversial. The reliance on probability statistics, the argument that the chance of coincidence was 1 in 100 million, introduced a dangerous precedent. Critics argue that the scientific certainty was exaggerated, based on unreliable estimates that lacked true statistical rigor. This raised profound ethical questions about the persuasive power of mathematics in the courtroom, where a jury, untrained in complex statistics, might interpret a low probability of coincidence as absolute proof of guilt. In subsequent decades, other courts have scrutinized and sometimes rejected the expansive use of the product rule and probabilistic evidence that was so central to the Williams conviction. The controversy over the fibers became a classic legal example of junk science being used to achieve a political outcome, demonstrating the peril of allowing novel science to be presented as infallible truth. In effect, Atlanta created a dual legacy. It championed the use of trace evidence and advanced forensic investigation protocols, but it also exposed the fragility of justice when scientific novelty is embraced with political fervor. The ethical debate ignited by the Williams trial continues to influence how DNA,
ballistics, and digital evidence are presented in court today, ensuring that the shadows of the Atlanta child murders extend far beyond the city limits and into the very fabric of American jurisprudence.
The Atlanta child murders unfolded at a critical juncture in American history, where racial stereotypes regarding crime were slowly evolving, and the case's final resolution delivered a devastating blow to the emerging narrative of Black political success. The conviction of Wayne Williams, a Black man, had a profound and complex impact on how the nation perceived race and crime. Before Williams' arrest, the national narrative was one of external white terror targeting a successful Black community. This evoked historical sympathy and galvanized civil rights groups. The focus was on systemic vulnerability and the historical enemy, the KKK, a narrative that fit within a well-understood context of racial struggle. However, the moment Williams was identified as the killer, the script flipped entirely. The media, which had spent months covering the victims' tragedies, quickly shifted to profiling Williams. The story became one of internal pathology, a monstrous aberration that arose from within the successful Black community. This narrative was embraced by the city's political structure as it allowed them to contain the crisis. The threat was not systemic racism, but a lone, disturbed individual. The consequence of this shift was immediate and damaging. The conviction allowed some segments of the national audience to dismiss the systemic issues of poverty and neglect that had rendered the victims so vulnerable in the first place. The focus was taken off the city's failure to protect its poor Black residents and placed squarely on the pathology of the killer. The implication, often subtle but powerfully present in media coverage, was that the problem of crime in the Black Mecca was a problem of its own making. Furthermore, the case, alongside the rise of other Black serial killers in the following decades, though unrelated, inadvertently contributed to a national media narrative that highlighted Black-on-Black crime. While all crime deserves attention, the intense, prolonged media spotlight on the Atlanta tragedy contrasted starkly with the often muted coverage of violence in other marginalized communities, suggesting a disproportionate focus when the perpetrator fit a certain racial profile that eased white anxieties about racial terror. The prosecution's portrayal of Williams as an arrogant, hyper-articulate, and ambitious individual further fed into a dangerous trope: the unsuccessful Black intellectual who turns his frustration and intelligence to malice. This psychological profile, whether accurate or not, was a narrative tool that allowed the justice system to categorize the terror as a personal failing rather than a social or racial one. In the long run, the Atlanta child murders became a complex symbol. It was a victory for the application of new forensic science, but a defeat for the transparency of racial justice. It shattered the simple narrative of Black success by imposing a chilling counter-narrative of internal devastation. The shadow of the case continues to complicate discussions about race, class, and crime in American cities, serving as a reminder of how quickly the media and the political establishment can reframe a tragedy to serve a more convenient social and political purpose. The sentencing of Wayne Williams in 1982 marked the end of the trial, but the beginning of a relentless 4-decade-long legal battle. From prison, Williams and a changing roster of defense attorneys have filed numerous appeals, habeas corpus petitions, and motions, all aimed at overturning his conviction
or, at the very least, forcing a new trial where the full scope of evidence, particularly the KKK links, could finally be examined. The foundation of nearly every legal challenge has remained consistent: ineffective assistance of counsel during the original 1982 trial and the suppression of exculpatory evidence by the prosecution. The argument is that Williams' initial defense was overwhelmed by the novel and complex scientific evidence and lacked the resources to fully challenge the fiber statistics or adequately investigate the myriad of alternative suspects, specifically those linked to white supremacist groups. A key point of contention in the appeals process has been the GBI tapes and intelligence regarding the KKK. Williams's lawyers have argued that this information was critical to his defense, as it would have presented a plausible alternative theory to the jury that multiple killers, driven by racial animus, were responsible for the wider string of murders. The continuous denial of access to these sensitive files has reinforced the defense's claim that the state of Georgia is actively preserving a political cover-up. More recently, the legal focus has shifted to the promise of DNA testing. Williams has repeatedly petitioned the court for the release of the biological evidence for advanced testing, believing it to be his strongest avenue for exoneration. The legal wrangling over this access has been protracted, with various courts debating the proper chain of custody, the viability of the samples, and the potential impact of a positive or negative result on the original conviction. The legal system, however, has proven highly resistant to reopening the case. Appeals have been repeatedly denied, often citing the overwhelming cumulative weight of the original circumstantial evidence and procedural adherence to the initial trial's findings. The judiciary seems reluctant to risk overturning a high-profile, politically sensitive conviction that brought closure to a major American city. The battle for a new trial is not simply about legal technicality, it is a moral confrontation with history. Williams's ongoing appeals, whether sincere or manipulative, serve as a constant reminder that the state's victory was built on compromise. As the years pass, the defense's argument gains subtle strength. The original conviction rests on 1980s technology and a politically motivated investigation. The refusal to apply 21st century science to resolve a decades-old mystery increasingly appears less about justice and more about protecting the historical integrity of a flawed verdict. The legal fight for a new trial is therefore the last lingering echo of the terror, constantly calling for a full, unvarnished airing of the truth.
More than 4 decades have passed since the first child vanished in the sweltering heat of 1979, yet the Atlanta child murders remain a wound that has never fully healed, a defining tragedy marked by a compromised resolution. The official closure, achieved through the controversial conviction of Wayne Williams, delivered immediate political stability, but inflicted a lasting legacy of doubt and systemic distrust that shadows Atlanta to this day. The case stands as a chilling study of how political expediency can corrupt the pursuit of criminal justice. The terror that gripped Atlanta was not just a criminal crisis, it was an existential threat to the city's identity as the Black Mecca. The rush to find a single, convenient killer, a man whose conviction could contain the chaos and deflect attention from deeper systemic failures and politically volatile leads, resulted in a verdict that satisfied the state
but failed the truth. The mass closure of over 20 child cases without individual trials remains a legal and moral stain, confirming for many that the city prioritized its image over a comprehensive investigation. The shadow of the murders is multifaceted. For the victims' families, it is the continuous agony of uncertain justice. They remain the central moral compass of the tragedy. Their decades-long struggle, a testament to the fact that their children were never fully accounted for by the justice system. Their demand for DNA retesting is not merely a legal motion, it is a plea for the dignity of their loved ones and a final confrontation with the system that they believe failed them at every turn. For Wayne Williams, the shadow is the isolation of his imprisonment and the paradoxical role he plays in the narrative. He is simultaneously the convicted monster and the defiant symbol of a compromised justice. Whether guilty or innocent, his case is a potent cautionary tale about the power of circumstantial evidence and the persuasive, sometimes manipulative, authority of state-sponsored forensic science in a pressured environment. For Atlanta, the city on the edge of the knife, the legacy is a persistent challenge to its self-image. The murders exposed the deep chasm between the prosperous black elite and the struggling, marginalized majority. The subsequent cover-up, real or perceived, damaged the fragile trust between the community and its elected leaders, proving that even a progressive administration, when faced with an existential crisis, may choose political survival over absolute transparency. The promise of modern DNA technology offers a final hope for clarity. If DNA evidence either conclusively links Williams to the child cases or, conversely, identifies unknown perpetrators, it will force a reckoning with the past. The reopening of the evidence files is an acknowledgement that the case of 1982 was closed based on the limitations of its time and the pressure of its politics. Ultimately, the Atlanta child murders will be remembered not only for the terrifying number of lives lost, but for the profound questions left unanswered. It is the story of a city that was too busy to hate, but perhaps too busy to truly see its most vulnerable. It is a haunting lesson that absolute truth is often the first casualty when politics, fear, and the desperate need for closure collide. The story will only truly end when the full, unvarnished history of every lost child is finally brought to light.